Hello, and welcome to the Transforming Loneliness interview series. I'm Laura Parker, the creator and host of the series. Transforming Loneliness approaches loneliness with fresh and unexpected ways of seeing and responding that cultivate connection, belonging, and love. Today, I'm very happy to be with Mushim Ikeda. Mushim Patricia Ikeda is a Buddhist teacher and author based at East Bay Meditation Center in downtown Oakland, California. She has a background in both monastic and lay practice, and she's a mother. I have only recently met Mushim. I learned that she was teaching a class at the East Bay Meditation Center on the topic of loneliness, and I was very interested to hear her perspective. My experience so far with Mushim is that she's very warm, generous, and open, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So thank you so much for being with us today, Mushim.
Thank you very much, Laura.
So, Mushim, what led you to teach a class on loneliness?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Laura. I taught it was a 3-class series that ended just recently, very experimental at East Bay Meditation Center. We hadn't directly addressed loneliness as a topic of any of our programming. And the reason the reason that I had proposed that topic was because I do look at the news, and I'm active on social media for community activism and organizing purposes. And I kept seeing a lot of posts about there being this so-called epidemic of loneliness. This really did concern me. And the more I saw, the more I thought, well, this would make a very interesting class series. And what it ended up being was titled Loneliness, Imperfection, and Resilience, a Buddhist-based approach. And that title indicates the specific way into this very large topic that I'm taking as a Buddhist teacher, and also as someone who's very active in community building and movement building in Oakland and beyond.
Okay, great. So when you mentioned that this title, Loneliness, Imperfection, and Resilience, ended up being like a doorway in, can you say more about the imperfection and resilience part of it?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. So first of all, we have loneliness, which I think probably most people would agree is an afflictive state, meaning a painful state of being, and something that the human being causes suffering to a human being, and therefore we want to try to address that suffering. And then to add to that, I added imperfection, because one of the primary teachings from the Buddhist tradition is that one of the chief characteristics of human life, which motivates people in many different ways to address it, including both materially and spiritually, is dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction with how things are. And in some cases, that's very reality-based and points to inequities, social injustice, all kinds of structural qualities in our society which need to be addressed through those at that level. And in other cases, the Buddhist teachings on suffering and imperfection point to ways in which the individuals and groups actually can address it through, number one, possibly reframing the thinking on the experiential part of what is being called loneliness, and number two, again, looking at ways in which we ourselves might be compounding the real suffering of loneliness with additional thinking, storytelling, and unhelpful behaviors. So that those are things we can actually address as we become aware of them through the use of mindfulness. So there's loneliness, there's imperfection, and then resilience is what we hope to gain so that every time we feel lonely, we don't necessarily go into catastrophizing it. And we're able to say, well, that's difficult and that's hard, and I feel lonely and I feel isolated. And here are some resources that I can use to buoy my spirits and to keep me feeling connected.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. I heard so much that I want to comment on. So you mentioned that there's a couple layers of the dissatisfaction. You mentioned the reality-based part of it that are based on the crises in the world and the systemic injustices. And then you also mentioned the parts of the dissatisfaction that have to do with either reframing our thinking or looking at the ways that we might be compounding the experience. And it seems to me like the second two, if we can deal with those, then we're more able to respond to the first one, the society-based things. That if we're crushed by our own thinking or our own how we're compounding our suffering, then we're much less able to respond to what the world needs from us. And I'm just curious, if you could say something about reframing thinking, how you deal with that, and also what are some of the ways that we compound our suffering when we're lonely?
Thank you. And before that, I'll take a step back and actually
Yeah.
reframe that.
Yeah.
Because in my experience, there is an order to this. And for people who are experiencing loneliness, first in that order comes acknowledgement and validation that there are structural issues.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, someone who has a chronic illness, I myself am a person with a disability, which is multiple chemical sensitivities.
Mm-hmm.
And so for people who are chronically ill and chronic pain, people who, because of inadequate employment and rights in the workplace, have to be working multiple shifts and they don't have enough time to do self-care and to be connected to their family and take care of their family and communities. Those are structural elements that are very real and that do produce and can produce intense isolation. So for the person who is experiencing that, they need that validation and that acknowledgement of, this is not my fault. I didn't create these systems. They do need to be addressed. And if I'm in chronic pain or I'm chronically ill, I'm probably not the best person because I don't have the health and the strength to be able to be doing the organizing work to address these. And I want people to be acknowledging this. I want to feel supported, that it's being acknowledged at the systemic level so that I can have some hope.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's the first part, is to say that a lot of what we're experiencing kind of is not our fault. To address feelings of guilt and shame, individual guilt and shame, which are, in my experience, never ever helpful. The Vietnamese Zen Buddhist teacher and peace worker Thich Nhat Hanh makes a very wonderful discernment between unproductive guilt and shame on one hand, and then on the other hand, what he calls beneficial regret, which means that if we've done something that we regret having done, that we ask for forgiveness. The other person or persons may give it or not. In any case, we forgive ourselves in the sense of saying, that was unfortunate, and now I'm going to try to change my behaviors, and I'm going to try not to do that again. So I'm observing that loneliness can be linked to some personal feeling of there's something wrong with me, and that can be in part alleviated by pointing to the systemic levels that of oppressions which separate people.
Right.
Yeah, so that having been said, going on to your question about reframing And what was the second part of that? So
Well, it was just, maybe these are related. You know, you mentioned that reframing thinking, and then you also mentioned becoming aware of the ways that we're compounding our suffering.
yes, really good. Thanks, Laura. So here's my observance. I'm a Buddhist teacher. I'm a spiritual teacher. I work with people a lot, both individually as well as in small groups, and then in larger groups. So over many years, my experience is that unfortunately, people who suffer from loneliness a great deal and then seek out other people, understandably, in order to find a compassionate response to their isolation, their fear, their need for connection, can sometimes not need to be reminded that the opposite of loneliness is warmth and supportive connection.
Mm.
And the way that we build warmth and supportive connection is through specific behaviors. And those specific behaviors include taking an active interest in other people's views, experiences, life issues, both joys and sorrows, and learning how to, in a certain way, regulate ourselves in order to not come across as a person who's constantly complaining about loneliness, but rather the person who's being vulnerable and saying, I am lonely, I need connection, and how are you doing today? What's happening in your life? Please, I want to hear about you, and being able to show those behaviors, because that's what produces the connection.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And so even as you said that, I'm hearing that that is a real skill to be developed, like the self-regulation, and then the ability to extend ourselves out in being interested.
And
Yeah.
more than interested, another behavior that can be learned and skill that can be learned is how to actively show appreciation for other people's good qualities.
Mm.
I was raised in a family where the thank you card was absolutely required for any kind of Christmas or birthday gift. And I've grown up in a culture of both in terms of my family, I'm a Japanese American, as well as the Buddhist training I've received. I've matured in an environment in which gratitude and expressions of gratitude are of primary importance. And so when we express gratitude to other people, not in a general way, not in a way of like, oh, I'm so grateful that you're alive or something. I mean, that's fine. However, it's better the more specific it is. Like, I'm really appreciating the way that you show up in community, and I see you quietly helping and cleaning up the snack area, and I see the ways in which you support events so that they go smoothly, and you never try to make a big deal of it. And maybe you think no one sees you, but really, I see you. I see you separating the landfill trash from the compost and the recycling. I see the way in which you just quietly kind of show up, and you're around in a way that other people respond to that, and they open up because you're so kind and you're so receptive. And I just want you to know, I see that, and I really appreciate being in community with you. I appreciate your being my friend because of very specific things. And I found that this practice, above all else, just opens people up in a way that whole new levels of connection open up. It's something very simple to do. We need to do it in a way that isn't attached to outcome. So other people might or might not be in a place where they respond, and that's fine. It has to be given freely with no attachments from an open heart. And that, for me, is an antidote, huge antidote to loneliness.
Yes, and I can see how it requires a training of the mind to really open our eyes and to notice how are people showing up and how are people contributing to me? Like, how am I being the beneficiary of other people's goodness? And so even that training of just starting to track that and look for it, that puts us in a kind of a mindset. And I can see how that would be hugely beneficial just for us, even before we open our mouth. And then when we open our mouth, then we're contributing that to others.
Exactly, exactly. I'm so glad you brought up that point, because it does require, in order to appreciate specific things, first of all, we need to notice them, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it is a training, because if we're in this kind of mindset of just, I'm focusing on my own misery here,
Mhm.
then we're not looking for it. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what is needed, is to include our own misery and our compassion for ourselves, and then to expand beyond it, and in a way even to posit to our brains, how am I going to act as if I'm not crushingly lonely? If I were not crushed by loneliness, what might I do to be more connected to other people? And then that can really help us.
Yeah. I can see how that connection can get built and get grown through those little actions and that mindset. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us just in general about what's the Buddhist take on loneliness?
Something that I brought into my class series, which actually came from radical Christian theologian Paul Tillich, I believe, is to propose to the participants of those classes that we can make a discernment. We can make a productive and creative discernment between what I was calling magnificent solitude, and on one hand, that is almost required for at least one part of spiritual growth and practice, not all of it, because community learning and friction actually is part of spiritual growth as well. However, there's a vertical dimension to most spiritual practices in which for which solitude retreat is traditional, the sojourn in the desert, so to speak, or it could be the retreat into the forest. Usually it has some natural component to it. However, it can be done in the middle of an urban environment as well, but in which magnificent solitude has a richness of the soul, if I may use that word, because Buddhists actually usually don't use the word soul. However, I think it's understood in our culture to mean that it's, the spiritual dimension of our being uh, is enriched by closing off some of the external stimuli and going into meditation, into solitude, into contemplation, and into prayer, whatever that spiritual lineage may be, in order to come closer to whatever our spiritual experience may be, of the very basic existential needs of the human being, to try to reach more understanding around our purpose in life, about life, death, suffering, and how that personally informs our activities and how we show up in the world. So that magnificent solitude can be delicious. It can be sought after, particularly for people. Most people, we have to work really hard and take care of our families. So clearing time and finding a space to support magnificent solitude is not an easy thing. It has economic implications, and also if you don't have good enough health, it's pretty hard to do. And so we really appreciate it. It's delicious, it's nourishing, it's satisfying to be out in the woods meditating and having simple yet nourishing food, that sort of thing. So that's magnificent solitude. How can we create that, and how can we support that more? in the midst of our busy lives. And then that's one hand. The other hand is afflictive loneliness. So that feeling of disconnection, which can happen in the midst of a crowd, in the middle of our family, or it can be that, again, because of structural elements, we really are isolated from other human contact. The feeling of disconnection, of isolation, usually of powerlessness as well, that for me forms what I'm calling the loneliness and the suffering of loneliness. So I asked the people who came to these classes, could you distinguish between those two so that they don't become conflated? And maybe there's an experience in which you find yourself, I'm lonely. And then you might think, well, but I now have the chance to do meditation, contemplation, and prayer for the next how many minutes or for the whole day. Wow, what an opportunity.
Oh, I see. So that you can really shift out of the afflicted state into an appreciative state.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, then you need to have practices to fill that state, because solitude, spiritual practice in solitude is not a disconnected state. It's totally connected. We're just connecting in ways where we might be connecting to a tree or a bird. If we're in a theistic religion, certainly to God, to the divine. In Buddhism, we might say we're connecting to Buddha nature, the nature for awakening, enlightenment, wisdom, and compassion that is said to be resident in all beings and in the world herself. That it's a state of supreme connection and complete lack of loneliness.
Yeah, and that said, I couldn't agree with you more. I've had a Buddhist meditation practice for a number of years, and I feel for me, one of the strongest things that helped me with my own experience of loneliness was connecting to the Buddha nature and really getting it in the ground of my bones and the cells of my body of what that is, and having it feel like a very reliable experience that I can tune into and connect with, that's there. Like it's this presence, that's this benevolent presence. At least this is my experience. I'm not saying it's like this for everybody, but it's this benevolent presence that's there. And then I feel the companionship of that presence. And then I feel less lonely. And I also feel like it changes my sense of who I am, And I'm just wondering, how do you go about teaching people to connect with the Buddha nature? I know that's a huge question, but is there anything you want to share in a small amount of time about that?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I think we can also maybe say that what we're calling Buddha nature can also be called the infinite potential for goodness.
Mm.
And that is a matter of both faith and observation. Hopefully, each of us can observe kindness, clarity, compassion, and wisdom in action, in others and in ourselves. And we also see plenty of non-wisdom, non-kindness, and confusion. Greed, hatred, delusion are said to be the three poisons of human existence in the Buddhist framework. So we see plenty of that at all scales, and speaking for myself, in myself as well. So to resist what, the neuroscientists and psychotherapists are wisely pointing out as the human being's brain's tendency towards negative filtering, towards filtering out positive, refreshing, beautiful elements, and instead concentrating on the negative. We need to restore a more 360-degree, a larger, more complete set of data, to just put it in really plain terms, by I think having practices that allow us to see, directly experience the interconnection of life and our part in that, where we really experience that. And something that I've started doing this summer, which has had unexpected benefits, is I've been going out in the morning. I have a little sort of ersatz deck to this apartment out back that is the extension of the house below us. And we do have trees around us, even though this is Oakland, there are a lot of beautiful trees. And I've been listening to the birds that are in the trees. And what came to me is that they do travel in pairs and flocks. And the flocks, when they are in a tree, at certain times in the day, they tend to talk to one another. And they're constantly, there's a lot of bird sound and a lot of chatter and a lot of sound that comes from a flock of birds in a tree. And when we open our minds to it in a meditative and a contemplative way, we can perceive how they're constantly checking in with one another to see if they're all right, if for the cohesion of the flock. There's an intense feeling of sociability and of friendliness and of checking in and of that mirroring and that echoing, which for human beings translates as, for ourselves, as warmth, as caring, as the affirmation of, we are not alone. We're here for one another. I've got your back.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So I'm hearing that you find that in your listening to the birds, you find that sociability, that friendliness, that warmth and caring, and the communication of, I'm here for you. I've got your back.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what birds feel because they're birds. They're
Yeah.
not mammals. However, I'm saying that what that would translate into for the human being and what we need from other human beings, and maybe from other mammals, because our brains are very much structured in the same way, is that quality of mirroring, of saying, I see you, I know you're there, I can't live your life for you, I can't fix your problems for you. And one of the principles I found out from my Catholic friends is the principle of what's called accompaniment, spiritual friendship, in which we say, we will accompany one another on our spiritual paths in our everyday lives through caring for one another, through acknowledging one another, and through saying, I'm here for you. And for the person who is experiencing loneliness, sometimes there's an expectation or a hope that I will get this on a massive scale from others. And if we don't get it, which is a cause for sorrow, I think the essential element, Laura, is that we learn to give it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I heard in that we also kind of have to learn how to lick our wounds when we
Yes.
don't get it. Like,
Yes.
like, oh, I wanted that and I didn't get it. And
Yes.
and there's still basic goodness in the world. And I loved your phrase, the infinite potential for goodness.
Yes.
Like, that's still there, even when I didn't get the thing that I was hoping to get.
Yes, and the resilience is also in a story I told to the class, which seemed to resonate with a lot of people, was that when I came back from 8 months in Buddhist monasteries in South Korea in 1988, I was culture shocked, and then I was reverse culture shocked. I was impoverished because I was under a vow of poverty. I was in pretty bad shape. And then I spent the next years digging myself out, and I went to a psychotherapist who was also a Buddhist teacher. And I complained and I said, the experience that I had in the monastery in South Korea was so kind of strange and not one that most people have experienced, that I feel really lonely and isolated because people I talk to don't understand my experience. And so I feel lonely. And he was a pretty resilient person himself. And he said, he wasn't actually from the United States. He was from another country. And he said, if you talk to someone and they don't understand your experience, go on and talk to someone else and keep talking to people until you find someone who does understand you.
Hmm.
And
And
when you said
so,
that, I thought, oh yeah, I could do that because I don't expect everyone to understand me.
yeah, great. Yeah, I'm hearing that you must have taken his advice and gone forward.
Not only did I take his advice, I eventually ended up, since I'm a writer, writing about the experience and getting it published. So that communicated to thousands of people.
Wonderful. So we're coming up on the time when we're going to need to finish for today, and I just wanted to check and see, is there anything you would like the audience to know about what you're up to and how they can keep track of your offerings to the world?
Thank you. I do have a website. It's www.mushimikeda.com, and I'll spell that M-U-S as in Sam, H as in Harriet, I, M as in Mother, I-K-E-D-A, Mushim Ikeda as one word.com. That would be one way. I don't have the capacity to publish everything I'm teaching there, so also a good place to go is eastbaymeditation.org for East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland.
Wonderful. And I hear you're also pretty active on Facebook, so people can find you there too.
Facebook is a really good way for me to communicate with a lot of people, yes.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today, Mushim. I really appreciate it. It's been just very delightful to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for hosting it, and I hope that the overall series is something that brings so much hope, joy, and happiness and skills, additional skills for people.
Thank you. I hope so too.